Very welcome to this Masterclass webinar. Just to let you know, we'll be getting going in literally 60 seconds. We just want to give everybody the opportunity to get in, sit down, relax, have a cup of coffee. I've one too. And we'll be getting going, as I say, in literally 60 seconds. Okay, we'll get going. You're good, Elaine?
I am, indeed.
Excellent. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ken Kilbride. I'm from ADHD Ireland. You're all very welcome to today's Masterclass. We began this series back in February 2021. We're now in our third year. It's a collaboration between the Institute of Neurodiversity, University College Dublin, NUI Maynooth, ADHD Ireland, the Neurodiversity Hub, and Untapped, which are in Australia. In this, we aim to showcase a diverse range of speakers and subjects from across the globe and the neurodiverse community, including academia and industry. All previous sessions are being recorded, as is this one, and they're available online on the UCD website. Sessions take place monthly on the fourth Thursday of the month. So if you're wondering what it is, this is the fourth Thursday of the month. Today's session is with Elaine McGoldrick, who's an educator and doctoral candidate on my learning journey, autism learning journey. So Elaine's journey began in the mid-80s when she started as a teacher and has worked across a variety of settings, both mainstream and special education. Identified autistic at 54, she shared lived experience of mental health, workplace and advocacy challenges with the autistic community. Burnout led to an early retirement, but Elaine continues to pursue her passion as an autistic voice in education as part of her professional doctorate in education with the London South Bank University. As an autistic teacher and a mum of two autistics, Elaine's research focuses on autistic parents-teacher collaboration. Her passion for rights-based inclusion saw her play a key role in promoting autism acceptance in Clonakilty, Ireland's first, as I am, accredited autism-friendly town. We're very much looking forward to the chat, but just before we get going, just to let you know, as you say, we run this series on the last Thursday of every month. So coming up next month, we will have Charlotte Fuller from the Institute of Neurodiversity on disclosure and leadership. I recently had the opportunity to see Charlotte speak at the ADHD Foundation conference in Liverpool in June, and I have to say, if you haven't booked on, I would recommend you booking on, because I'm going to book on that myself. On the 26th of October, we have Professor Jackie Rogers from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne, who will be talking about ADHD and anxiety. And then on the 23rd of November, there's Dr. Lorna Hamilton from York University on designing neurodiversity and applying universal design for compassionate pedagogy in higher education. Just very quickly before we start, just a quick in terms of ground rules. And because we're doing this online, you can leave your mobile on or turn it off. It's totally up to you. There's no emergency exits. Go out your front door if you have any challenges. In terms of that, we do have left some time at the end for some questions. So if you do have a questions, pop them into the Q&A rather than the chat. What we find is there's a little challenge here in terms of the way Zoom is set up, and that if it's in the chat, we can't actually transfer it across to the Q&A. So if you do have any questions or comments for Elaine, please pop them into that. As I mentioned, we will be recording this talk, and if you want, you can also use the live transcription so you can hear the talk as well. So thank you very much for that. Now at this point, I pass you over to Elaine, and we're very much listening forward to her talk on her autism journey.
Thank you, Ken. Can I share my screen now?
Yeah.
Is that over? Okie dokes, share screen. And there we go. Is that okay?
Not yet.
Not yet. There we go. Right.
Now.
So have you now?
Yeah.
Cool. Great stuff. So we'll go from the beginning. Okay. Apologies. It's always, and we thought we were well set up in advance, didn't we?
Well, we were when we practiced beforehand.
There we go. Resume slideshow. I have it. Yeah. I think. Yeah. Are we there?
I can see your slides.
Good stuff. Okay, so thank you all very much for joining me this evening, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and share the work. It really is an honour. And I'm going to talk to you about autism as a learning journey. And I suppose, like every journey, we all need to know, where we're going. And I know it's a bit old-fashioned there to see them looking at the map, but whenever I think about autism as a learning journey, it's always that case of, the joke where the tourists are looking for directions, and the local says, well, I wouldn't start from here. And really and truly, that is the case when it comes to learning about autism. We haven't necessarily been starting in the right place. So the picture you see here in front of you, the cat among the penguins, this for me kind of symbolizes what it's like to be an undiagnosed autistic or a masking autistic trying to just survive. We're hiding in plain sight. Sometimes we can pass and sometimes we're not. And, it's a whole sort of muddle and confusion of different things going on. So looking back at my own autism learning journey, I would have started, like most teachers, with the initial knowledge of autism theories acquired through CPD and evidence-based practices. Then I suppose, for me, I always found it very, very hard to stick to these things. There were sort of alternative instincts that are showing themselves that I now know I can put down to my neurodivergence. And then in terms of the EdD research focus, like Ken said, it's on the autistic parent element. And of course, we will finish up with autistic accounts of autism, the double empathy and monotropism. So I would imagine that most people here are fairly familiar with the DSM and the diagnostic criteria and all the rest. But what I want to kind of draw your attention to is the language that's used there. So when we're talking about things like impairments and restrictive, repetitive and weak, lack, those are words that sort of charge us almost to run in there and help, and we need to be very, very careful, I suppose, in a way, because sometimes we can make all sorts of ableist assumptions that aren't necessarily appropriate. So what tended to happen was, from those deficit-based, which, in fairness to them, they're pathological-based medical backgrounds, so they're looking for cause and cure. So we get this evidence-based practices emerging that are there, that go on, and these are the ones that are most common in Irish schools, from Barry et al. 21. So the meme up here is one of my favorites. Unless you're using evidence-based procedures, I can't hear a word you're saying, because very often as autistics, that's the attitude that we will get when we try and discuss this sort of thing. But I'm glad to say that's changing. So also important to know that Irish teachers don't tend to be terribly familiar with all of these, and it tends to be more special class than mainstream class. But, with everything, there needs to be a word of caution, and particularly here with what classifies as best practice. Bottom-up Patel et al. In 2020 did a review of psychoeducational therapies with young autistic children, and they found the studies were very, very poorly designed. There were failures to disclose conflicts of interest, questionable, if any, reporting of adverse effects. Now, any college student will tell you, you need all of these things to be in place for a study to be considered, reputable and valuable. But this is what they found, and that's the situation as it stands currently. The autistic community in general, I suppose we have very strong reasons why we are very much against behaviour-based practices like ABA and PBI, etc. And, Borden King 2020, again, reviewing lots of studies, finding that evidence of ABA effectiveness, it's not terribly strong. It's unproven, if anything. And, one of the studies she quotes is actually the American Department of Defense, So, that's gone too fast on me. I'm going to go back. Apologies. I'm waffling. So compliance-based is when we're talking about behavior-based practices. So we're trying to enforce the behavior, if you like. So it's compliance-based. And for me, that denies autonomy and human rights. And we know that there is an increased risk of post-traumatic stress disorder. But yet, this still very often persists as best practice. So my approach, I suppose, with evidence-based practice, this is Comic Book Stories, which is based on the work of Carol Gray. And here it's a lovely little setup, because what you're doing is maybe you're going back over something that's happened in the art or whatever, with speech bubbles and thought bubbles. So it gives that opportunity to have a bit of fun and discuss things and all the rest. But I kind of felt, was a bit limited in a sense, because this is what a class in my room tends to look like. So what had happened here was this was a particular child who had huge problems addressing any kind of issues that arose. And this was the first time we got to communicate. Now, if I had been, sticking to fidelity of implementation and all the rest, I might never have had that opportunity with him. And you can see here, like, there's a very clear expression involved. He wants freedom. He doesn't like staying at school. And all of those exclamation marks, he told me, were prison bars. But this was the beginning of a fantastic, communication that we could set up, that we could go and we could revisit maybe issues that had arisen in a fun way, without threatening the child, So an honest check-in, this is hugely important from my point of view. We spend a lot of time teaching children about emotion regulation and identifying emotions. And they may come to us and tell us, like, I'm too sad to work today, and we don't believe them, or we tell them that, that's nonsense. So for me, if a child is identifying an emotion, then that's my cue to go with that rather than with whatever lesson I may have had planned for that day. Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 situations here that will probably be referred to as unacceptable, challenging, and attention-seeking behaviour. And again, we'll come back to this whole idea of the language and how language influences. So when we're looking at it like that, it's all about what they have to do. They're identified as the problem, In the first case, this girl was having a meltdown and was expressing herself rather loudly. Now, it was a safe space. It was just myself and herself. But the principal happened to walk outside, heard the commotion, came in, to help with the discipline, if you like. And of course, poor kid spooked and ran out the door, and the next guy was a little guy who'd been on the yard, and obviously something had gone wrong, and he'd run back into school, and just that whole kind of sit and collapse and the head down and the hands and all the rest of it. And teachers wanted to get him back into class. And of course, he wasn't responding because he had shut down. This kid was just trying, to sort everything out, and people were trying to interfere with him. And just again, as I say, when you're looking at it in terms of what the child is doing, then, we can sometimes turn things on their head. And then this final guy reminds me very much of a situation I was in one particular school where the kid wouldn't come in off the yard, and I asked if I could chat with him, and they said, no, Bach. Now, for any of you who don't speak Irish, that means don't bother. And what had actually happened here was that this kid, everybody was at the end of their tether with him. But the thing was, they kept doing the same thing over and over again. So, of course, they weren't necessarily going to get anywhere, So really, when I see these situations, for me, these kids are exhibiting distress, and it's a distress that I'm all too familiar with because I would have had these experiences myself, not just as a child, also as an adult. But so when we see that distress, it's about us connecting with them. It's what we have to do, how we have to provide for these situations where they are clearly overwhelmed, but they have safe channels, and we are that safe space for them. Okay, so enough of me. We'll do a little bit on the research for a moment. Internationally, it has been found that teachers' dispositional characteristics really don't match with autism in terms of that they lack the training, time, or patience to understand the need of an autistic child. I hate any of those big generalized statements because obviously that's not the case for every teacher, but this is particularly true in terms of the Irish situation. We meant for inclusion to replace integration, but very often what we're left with is integration. So where the child comes into the class and has to get on with it, which is integration. So this quote I hate, but I use it because it typifies an attitude that I think still prevails. So teachers were particularly positive about the fact that students were not overprotected by the mainstream environment and would benefit in the long term from being exposed to difficult situations. Now, can you imagine that being said about any other minority group? And why is it okay to speak like that about our autistic students? Good example, Craig Goodall in Northern Ireland, he wanted to figure out the perceptions of students in terms of inclusion. So the students were involved at every single point in this research process, and we refer to that as participatory research. So they concluded that it was an interaction between a whole load of factors in the school that included the environment, but very importantly was teacher understanding, teacher knowledge, peer ignorance, which was huge. And I know you've had talks previously about the LEANS project, but I would highly recommend going to see that, to see how to deal with teaching about neurodiversity and acceptance and dealing with that ignorance piece. So just to sort of recap, teacher knowledge can come from professional sources, from other colleagues, from informal personal sources, and also from media representation. And that can be a good or a bad thing in any kind of combination that you like, you know. But the bit that's missing, of course, is from teacher knowledge, is the experts by experience, statistics, and whether that's autistic teachers. And there's a lot of work being done by Rebecca Wood and Claire O'Neill as well, in UCC, around autistic teachers. So that's beginning to emerge, but also our autistic parents. Yeah. So I'm going to kind of give you some of the things that I would have heard or would have been said to me in terms of parent-teacher meetings. When you've gone in with a big problem that you're very concerned about. There's no problem in my class. Sure, they join in and everything. They're playing you up. You need to put your foot down. There are at least a dozen children there that I'd worry about before I'd even think of them. They bring it on themselves. Horrible victim blaming, usually directed at girls for being bullied in the yard. I have a big class, I can't cater to every child. I have to work for the greater good. And then finally, they're well able to do it when they want to. Now, for me, as a teacher, as a former dyslexia tutor, that is a huge red flag that we need to investigate. Yeah. So why is it that teachers are, I suppose, being dismissive? Not in all cases, I hasten to add, you know. Why is that? And very often it's because of autistic masking, and not teachers aren't necessarily aware of this or able to believe that we can mask as well as we do. And that's not limited to teachers. I had a child psychiatrist tell me one time that I couldn't be autistic because nobody could mask that well. So really what the teachers are seeing is they're seeing this well-behaved, hardworking, gifted, eager to please, compliant child. And of course, they're looking for like flight and fight in terms of if a child was distressed or if there was anything up in the class or whatever. Also, we've got to remember that, you know, freeze and fawn are also trauma responses. So the freeze would be like my friend on the ground, you know, with his head down, trying to shut everything out or just kind of going blank. And it is a coping mechanism and a survival method. And then fawning is where you're really, really that compliancy, you know, where you're trying to get it all right. And of course, we slip up, you know, inevitably we slip up. But what we have then, when that child comes home, because they've been holding on so much all day long, they have what we call post-restraint collapse. And it's very often described in terms of the that, you know, it's shaking every time, you know, something kind of doesn't go their way in school. And then, of course, once they get home, the cap comes off. And so teachers aren't seeing that. And sadly, parents, you know, we don't tend to be accepted as good witnesses in these situations. So what we're seeing is all the anxiety, social confusion, panic attacks, you know, need for perfection, stomach aches, excessive worrying, and absolute exhaustion. So what happens when, as parents, when we arrive in and we're expressing these concerns, and for people who aren't aware of, you know, masking, etc. So you have unmet needs, which of course negatively impact mental health. And then that, you know, spirals because the need gets more complex and all the rest. So where we're talking about internalized presentation, you know, that child that's holding everything in, the impact is only seen at home. And if the needs aren't met, we're talking about increased absence and maybe eventually withdrawal from school entirely. And these are kids who want to be at school, who want to learn. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have the external presentation. So now this is going to impact both home and school. But again, if those needs aren't identified and met, very often what will happen is you'll see a child having a reduced curriculum, a reduced timetable. They may be excluded from certain subjects. They may be, you know, asked not to go on the school tour, things like that. And, you know, and again, if this keeps accumulating, we can be looking at suspension or expulsion. So, you know, for me, whoever it is raising the red flag, it's really, really important that we, you know, double check. And that will be the feel really. So what's at stake? Autistic mothers face challenges communicating with non-autistic professionals. So we might have heightened anxiety, difficulty deciding what we're supposed to say and not say, and the big one, feeling misunderstood. Yeah. Also, and this is from the Royal College Pediatrics and Child Health, many professionals value school reports above the parental ones. And autistic parents are 4 times more likely to face queries regarding their parenting competency. And there's no evidence for that. There's no need for that. It's pure bias. And then you have accusations of fabricated induced illnesses, these kind of Munchausen's by proxy, that it's the parent that has the problem looking for attention. And that can lead to care placements for some children and young people. And so what you're talking about here is, for those of us as autistic parents, that we end up in a negative spiral, desperate, to persist in seeking support for our child or young person. And it does eventually get to the point where you feel as a parent, look, I just have to do this myself. Homeschooling is my only option. There's a fantastic study done by Ruth Moyes. I've linked to, she's a wonderful video on school anxiety, and I've linked to it in my references at the end. Well worth your while having a look at it. So I'm going to show you some real life examples. These come from reports that would have been sent to a GP. And the first one towards the end of the final paragraph of the letter was, some themes emerged as obstacles to behavioural management. Mum's poor belief, CYP, child or young person, be allowed to express distress. And the child or young person was in charge of most decisions concerning themselves. Now, those are human rights, and it's extraordinary that would be seen in a sense as a barrier, in terms of the parenting here. Mum struggles with mental health. Now, as a general rule, those of us who are autistic, at this stage in life, we will, and the CYP was acutely aware, no judgment there, says you. And then finally, the background breakdown in homeschool communication, and they had inverted commas banned from school. Now, this is the oversharing piece that I was talking about earlier, because this is actually me that they're talking about here. And I probably said I was effectively banned from the school. Basically, they asked me to make an appointment if I was coming in. It's not, that was the public system. This is common from the private system, that mum felt she wouldn't be able to commit to a treatment plan that involved the child or young person being exposed to the potential anxiety of school attendance being consistently enforced. And make no mistake about it, what we were talking about here was getting that child into school regardless, kicking or screaming. And the other interesting thing is that, my husband would have been there for all of this as well, but you'll see there's no mention of that. So that, I suppose, kind of has piqued my interest in terms of my own research piece. Also, I sort of feel now when I look back and all that if I knew I was autistic then, if I knew more about, just neurodiversity in general, that I probably would have handled it a lot better. And I'd love to think that maybe I can do something to bridge that gap for other autistic parents. So I looked at the challenges faced and the preferences of autistic parents currently with their kids. This was a small pilot study. So of the 15 children and young people represented, 60% struggled to attend on an equal or irregular basis. Overall, parent satisfaction with school, it varied. Now, I like that because that means that some of the time school are getting it right, but just not consistently enough. 83% believed that most teachers had poor, stereotyped or damaging knowledge of autism and autistic strengths. And only 33% of those parents were prepared to be openly autistic or, for fear of stigma and bias and all the rest. And 100% believed that schools did not consider autistic adult inclusion. And that's true for all disabilities. I think, and really for true inclusion, we need representation. So the main themes that came out with diversity of knowledge, which was described by one person as woeful to exemplary, and there's something in my way on the screen here for reading this, my apology. There we go. I don't think they've any understanding of masked autism, late diagnosis, or high functioning. And then you have the harmful practice. So we were talking about the behaviourism earlier. the ableism in that is that assumption that because the majority of people are able to do this, you should be able to do it. And then classroom management. Now, classroom management piece there was a class that was disrupted by another child, and the teacher was having difficulty managing that. And it was the autistic child who missed out there, who didn't get to go to the lessons. And the parent reported sort of being told that, oh, that was a special education issue. So we're back to that whole distinction between integration and inclusion there. So it's hard for teachers trained in the traditional deficit model of autism to switch to a neurodiversity affirmative approach, but the benefits are enormous. Not only will autistic children benefit, but the teachers will have an easier time engaging and teaching their pupils. And that's true for all of the pupils, not just those few known individuals. So parents then also spoke about school engagement challenges. So there was this kind of difference in terms of what parents saw as their rights and responsibilities and what the teachers saw. The hostile environment, here you're talking about, the attitudes and judgments of people and becoming, that parent that they all dread to see, and communication. We know that communication is a key criterion in a diagnosis of autism, but we don't necessarily allow for that when communication breaks down. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the intimidating environment and the dismissive attitude are challenging to overcome, but you do your best in order to support your child because no one else sees the truth of their condition. Yeah. And then finally, strong desire collaboration was like jumping off the pages all the time. So there were a lot of frustrations expressed, and this whole idea, like that, wanting to address needs, wanting to sit with the teachers and problem solve for their child, So the suggestion was that by acknowledging that parents of autistic kids are frequently autistic, checking communication needs, example, written notes or recordings of meetings, believing and accepting autistic input, and of course, acting on it whenever possible. That's what the parents that I would have engaged with in my study felt. So I love this picture. I'm just going to put it in here to give you a little bit of a break. So when you look at that, what do you see? This was a situation where kids had a water balloon fight, and I asked them to tidy up. And this is what you got. Now, to me, this is a thing of beauty and a joy. For someone else, it might be an annoyance that they haven't actually put it in the bin, but that's for another day. So, and it's very similar in terms of our perspective when it comes to education, and autism, whether that's in terms of your definition of autism or the type of research that you want to do. And I've done it again, sorry. So this was a study by Bolte and Cage. And so they found that studies based on that medical model increased the likelihood of the ableist cues, the dehumanization and the stigmatization, compared to neutral or social-based models. And the social-based model is where you sort of see the environment as disabling the person. And then participatory research was found to predict significantly lower odds. And that makes sense because you're talking to actual autistics. Yeah. So let's have a look at some of these autistic accounts of autism. So a really, really important one is the whole double empathy problem. And this was Damien Milton 2012, and he talked about that mutual bidirectional misunderstanding. And very often what we tend to do is we look at the autistic person and we say, oh, look, can't read between the lines, they can't overcome other people's misconceptions about autism, and they can't manage their sensory distractions, so we need to fix them. But the thing is, this is two-way communication. It's a two-way street. And non-autistic people aren't terribly good either at, understanding our thoughts and our experiences. So this is where the double empathy comes in. Just that whole business of stop for a moment and check. So if a child tells you it's too noisy today and it was even noisier yesterday, the balance is tipped for them and it is too noisy. So this idea that not at all, you were fine yesterday, get on with it. We really, really, really have to stop and think and, take this whole double empathy factor into account. Okay, so I'm going to move on now, and I'm going to play a little 4-minute video about monotropism because it's, for me, I never identified myself in terms of the descriptions from those dominant theories. And, you know, for all of the study that I did around autism, I had no idea. So this is monotropism. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so apologies for that, a little bit of technical. But what I'm going to do now, I'm going to look back at some of those points that was Kieran Rose, who was speaking there, the autistic advocate. And again, I've links to that in the references later on. So let's go back at some of the things that were said. And of course, Murray et al. Are the people who are accredited with bringing this to the world's attention, if you like, but that was back in 2005. But fortunately, people are becoming more and more aware of it, and it's featuring in more studies as time progressed. So it's that idea of like being in that attention tunnel, of not having a focus on a lot of things like most people do, but that, you know, limiting that focus into an area. So here we have, the typical scenario that we're used to hearing in terms of sensory overload for autistic people, and you have everything going on in the background. So whenever a broad use of attention is required, even subconsciously, monotropic minds are challenged by the different cognitive processes competing for their treasured resources. So we're pulled in every direction, if you like, where other people can just filter this stuff out. Yeah. And then ultimately tunneling, when we think of it, it's a rational strategy and it's not a weakness or a dysfunction. Okay, this is an example of monotropism in the classroom. So this is quote by Fergus Murray: to have an easier time with your autistic students, try entering into their attention tunnel rather than tugging them out of it. So let's have a look. Okay, so, oh, apologies here. No, I'm having a nightmare, aren't I? Oh, sorry. I'll pause them. Okay, sorry about that. So what had actually happened there was, this was a child who came in to junior infants, and like had an enormous file, and there were all sorts of reports and what have you written about them. So when they came in, my sense was follow, don't lead, and rather than working with, say, tabletop activities, I allowed the child to play, and within that play I would take photographs and then later on show the photographs, and the chat that we had about the photographs then became the basis for the reading lesson and the book. But what I want to do is show you where this went to for the child, and hopefully it'll work. Apologies. Come on, dinosaurs. No.
Elaine, just to say that if you want to activate the sound, you can just press the share screen button, and on the bottom left it'll have a little tick box, and you can tick activate your sound. It might work.
Okay, thanks. Oh, I'll move on. But sorry, in terms of where this was going for the child, you can see here is making that connection between the magnifying glass and the mystery. And like, there's no way, if I had limited myself to what was in the reports about that child, there's no way I could have anticipated this was coming. So it can be quite magical to get in there and join, as we say in the let's see if I can take control of this again. Okay, so by entering into a monotropic state, autistic people can gain predictability and control over their immediate environment, a sense of achievement, and in the moment fun. So, you'll also know this is stimming, and that can be a sign of autistic joy as much as distress. For me, the raindrops chasing down the window was a favorite, particularly if you're on a bus on a rainy day and you had all those extra smells and sounds and sights. This was so relaxing for me. Of course, the happy flapping is a very important one. At school, I would have used shaving foam a lot, and a lot of the kids really loved it. We even did spelling tests and shaving foam. And then a sensory box. And the sensory box can be made up of anything you fancy at all. So here, they're just bits and pieces that would have been around the classroom anyway. And obviously, stimming is natural, it's fun. We all do it to some extent. Okay, and then in terms of, Kieran was talking about this idea of finding the hook and building inertia, and then being pulled out of that monotropic flow too quickly, being painful. This is a wonderful description. I'm not going to go into it, but just even visual to see that idea of putting out all these tendrils and getting entangled and entwined in what you're doing, and needing time to pull those back in before you move on to the next activity. And how disruptive that can be. So I'm going to give you a real life example. This student arrived in terribly upset. This is one of those kids who would mask in class, but didn't when they came to me. So, and this is what they wrote: everything is wrong, and all those exclamation marks. And you see, for this particular kid, capitals meant shouting, and you can see the writing's getting bigger. So really, really distressed. Now, that's not the time to talk about stuff, what's going on and all the rest of it. It was a few days later when we actually got to talk about it. And this was the problem. We stopped a test for yoga. It's very, very stressful. We never stop a test. I was twisting and pulling my fingers. I was very stressed. She was saying, think of all your worries and squeeze them out. I was saying, leave, and I probably would. We never stop a test. Now, for anyone looking on and seeing a child kind of get miffed by something like this, it doesn't make sense. And this is this ableist piece that we're talking about, because it doesn't make sense to you. What's actually happening here is that monotropic wrench being pulled out of the tunnel too quickly and having huge consequences and effects for this particular child. It would have lasted all of the day, you know. And then monotropism is wonderful in terms of explaining the idea of the spiky profile that we'd often see in autistics. So that idea that we're either utterly obsessed with something or just can't be bothered. And, you know, Murray et al. Here saying, they suggest that uneven skill profile that you see in autism depends on which interests have been fired into the monotropic superdrive and which have been left unstimulated by any felt experience. And I'm going to, you're coming to the end, folks, thank God. This is a little book that was made by another one of my students. And with this student, I'm hoping it's going to open up for you. There you go, there's no sound this time. This particular student, again, you know, was on a reduced timetable, parents on standby to bring them home, all sorts of problems, wouldn't engage with any kind of printed material. But instead, we both shared an interest in coding. And so we would sit and it literally was, you know, getting into the flow, and, you know, to the point where the SNA sometimes would think we weren't in the room because neither of us we were both heads down in the laptop. But it made such a difference to this kid, and it gave that bridge towards literacy and taking an interest in reading. And he got to compete and win a national competition with this. And like, to see him holding his own with the judges and explaining where the coding was, it was just phenomenal. So there is an awful lot to be gained from doing that. Yeah. So, key points, I'm almost done. The square peg in the round hole, we're all very familiar with it. But I think in schools, we tend to put all the emphasis on the effort of getting that square peg into the round hole without always stopping to think about the damage that we're actually doing, you know. So again, I would say, your empathy, take it twice. Try the monotropic lens to see if that makes sense of the situation that maybe seems, you know, unexplainable otherwise. You know, kids, in their behavior, there's communication, you know, and it's connection and not attention seeking that they're after. Again, coming back to this idea of human needs, they're not special. They should be equal, not special. And of course, nothing about us without us. So that's me. Thank you very, very much. And apologies for the few glitches in there. Thank you. Ken, yeah.
Hi, Elaine, how are you? Thanks for that. No, that was fascinating. Just before, just to say to anybody, if you do have some questions or comments, you know, we've 10-15 minutes to go, so please pop them into the Q&A there, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. But I was just noticing there, I put into the chat very early on, you know, whereas here in Dublin, it's sort of sunny and overcast, and we have a very poetic crowd here today. I thought, you know, there was white fluffy clouds in Birmingham. Someone had glimpses of blue skies in London. And it was sunny and lovely in Northern California, which it always is. But the one that actually took me was, it was hot and humid in Georgia from Erin. I just want to know, has Donald Trump then arrived? We're getting political today. Just before we just get to the questions there, you know, I'm a little bit older than you, but we both started going to school at the same time. You know, we came out of work, you know, we both have children who would have autism, and they've gone through the system at this stage. General opinion on things getting better, or where are we today?
It's mixed. Yeah, it's very, very mixed. And I think, you know, that very small pilot study that I did really reflected that parents can have amazing experiences. There can be individual teachers who are outstanding, individual schools, whatever, but it's not consistent. It's very, very much hit and miss. There was a recent study done in Plymouth that was very interesting, and they were kind of comparing older teachers with newer teachers, and they felt that the older teachers were more label dependent than the younger ones were, and they put that down to the fact that very often nowadays they will have autistic peers neurodivergent peers within their classroom growing up, you know. So there's a lot to be gained, but we have a lot of catching up to do. And I think it's one of those things that you can't ignore it, the damage that can be done with all of this, and it is very real. And, you know, those kids that cannot get into school and attend school, we have to deal with it. You know, it can't be swept under the carpet any longer.
Okay, thanks for that. Can we just go straight to the questions?
Thank you.
I'm guessing this person's from Ireland because they've used the acronym SNA, but I think it's an interesting point in terms of SNA, Special Needs Assistant, or CNO in the UK. I know it's probably this presentation is probably more geared towards teachers, but what can SNAs or CNOs do to help?
Yeah, I think it's again, familiarize yourself with the whole idea of monotropism, because it makes so much sense of so many behaviors that seem, you know, I suppose that people are struggling to understand, you know. And for me, as an autistic myself, you know, I didn't recognize my autism until I started reading what other autistics had to say. And then you're kind of, oh, that's what that is. And, you know, because very often what you're seeing is your own story written in somebody else's words, you know, over and over again. It's very common, particularly when we get together and all the rest. I'm going a bit off the point there, sorry. So I would sort of say, familiarize yourself as much as you can with autistic accounts of autism. And looking at, you know, any interaction that you have with that child from that double empathy point of view. Please understand that, you know, most of us, we're all giving our best, and this is true of teachers as well as students, like that we are doing our best for that particular point in time in that moment. Like when you let go of this idea that the kids are out to get you or that they're trying to pull a fast one on you, everything changes, you know. You start to see and making, for me, it's a connection based. And once you have that connection, then the learning just happens, you know. Hope that's okay.
No, that's great, thank you. Question it's from an anonymous attendee. As an autistic mom and parent myself, and someone who likes to follow the research, she didn't say this, but besides from yourself, what researchers would you recommend?
Okay, there's a lot going on. Ruth Moyes, Dr. Ruth Moyes, I was talking about there in the trust. She's got some fantastic work on absenteeism. Rebecca Wood is doing a lot of stuff on autistic teachers. Claire O'Neill on the Irish front is also doing some work there. Sue Fletcher-Watson is fantastic in terms of the whole neurodiversity paradigm and a lot of the work that she's doing. Pete Warmby is an autistic teacher himself and has brought out a couple of books. Fergus Murray is amazing, absolutely amazing. And monotropism.org is the website there where all of the resources on monotropism can be found. So that would be a good place to start. Okay.
Thanks for that. Earlier in the slides, Ashley has said you mentioned PBI with CBT info. Could you elaborate a little bit or advise on what is exactly
what I'm talking about? Yeah, I think, you know, it's ABA is brain is dead now at this idea. It's behaviorism, okay? So it's applied behavioral analysis. Sorry, it came. And the PBI then, I suppose, you know, there's this grumbling going on in terms of ABA not being the best idea in the world and all the rest of it. And, you know, for people who are invested in it, obviously, nobody's going out there to harm kids. Everybody's going out there to do their absolute best. And like, they've got buckets and buckets of research to back them up and saying that this is the best thing. The only problem is that that research hasn't actually consulted with autistic people. It's all about the external version of autism as opposed to the internalized experience that is huge. Like, and I don't think neurotypical people necessarily get the extent to which, you know, we can't let go of something until it's resolved. That whole monotropic thing has been caught in that tunnel, you know. So PBI is, I suppose, you know, positive behavior interventions. But if it's a behavior intervention, it's still a behavior intervention, and it's, you know, you're still denying that child the autonomy to say, no, I don't want to do this. And when you stop and think about, you know, kind of the statistics that are there for disabled people in terms of any kind of crimes or violence or what have you, we really do need to be empowering our kids to be able to look after themselves. And if we're kind of going to, I suppose, if we're pursuing something that's compliance-based, we're denying them that opportunity.
Okay.
That's fair.
No problem, Bridget.
Yeah.
Just purely for time as much as anything else, we're just
Yeah,
going to
of
take
course.
two questions together. So this one's coming in from Joe Curran. It says, just looking at your slides on monotropism and thinking of hyperfocus in ADHD, would you have any
Yes.
thoughts? There's also another
Yes.
question, is monotropism also common for people with ADHD?
Absolutely, particularly the hyper-focus side of it, you know. And I suppose the downside of that in terms of mental health, in terms of getting stuck and being very hyper focused. Sonny Hallett actually was an illustrator on one of those slides, and they do a lot of writing on that area, you know, of being caught in those loops of thought. Yeah. So yes, very much a crossover, definitely.
Oh, thank you. Does Gemma want to ask questions, or shall I just keep going? It feels like I'm hogging the screen, that's all.
Sorry,
you're
Ken,
fine.
were you talking to me? Or?
Indeed, yes.
There's a few questions just in the chat. First, and sorry for interrupting you earlier, Elaine. I just wanted to help you with the sound.
Thank
you. Brian is looking for a recording, and I don't see why we can't share it if that's okay with Ken and yourself,
Yep.
to those who have registered.
Absolutely.
And then Brian put another message in the chat: is neuroaffirmative care very common in practice in society? Why isn't it being used correctly? That might be in the Q&A as well. That's it. That's all I can see.
No, absolutely. I'm 100% with you. You know, we can't ignore this stuff. You know, we have to start. And it literally is just about live and let live. There's no, like, very often people talk about, like, oh, we need all this specialist training and we need the specialist knowledge. We just need a bit of common sense, and we need a little bit of compassion, you know, and compassion in the context of double empathy, you know. So it's about what this child is experiencing, not how I see the situation on the outside. But yeah, it is, and everybody benefits, you know. That's the beauty in all of these things. Yeah.
Okay. And thanks for that. And I like this question because it has a little barb at the end. Is neuroaffirmative very common in practice, in the practices that you see? And if not, why not, in your opinion?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is neuroaffirmative care very common in practices you see and hear about? And
okay.
Then, if not, why not, in your opinion?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not? Why not? Because for too long we've been told by experts that this is how you deal with things. Yeah. In terms of all of the research. So if you think back again to those original theories and that idea of the pathological model where they're, you know, it's kind of medicine based, so we're looking at cause and cure, and we want to fix these people and make them better. There's nothing wrong, folks, you know. There's nothing wrong that a good bit of common sense isn't going to sort out for you, you know. But those interventions have been pitched very highly, and they've been backed, you know, consistently. And it's only recently that we've started to have an autistic presence, we'll say, and a voice in terms of academia. And there's some amazing autistic scholars out there. Dr. Mary Doherty is somebody who's doing amazing work within the medical community, you know. So things are changing, and we're beginning to see it, and we're beginning to feel it, you know. So fingers crossed, we'll get there.
Just let you know, we have just roped in Dr. Mary Doherty to this group. Just Gemma has her hand up there, so guessing she wants to jump in. Maybe not.
Maybe not.
Okay.
Sorry, Ken, my sound is off. There was just a message in the chat there. It was an interesting question in the Q&A. Are autistic people often introverts?
Can be. We come in all shapes and sizes, all makes and models. So for some, yes. For others, no. Like, it's human nature at the end of the day, you know. So yeah, absolutely. And extroverts as well. And I think sometimes people don't consider autism because the person, you know, seems bubbly and chatty and all the rest, but that can be masking, you know. The other, I suppose, the big issue for me, or the thing that held me back from recognizing I was autistic, would have been around empathy. So many of us are hyper empathetic, you know, and yet we had this theory going back to the early 2000s of, you know, zero empathy and extreme male brain, you know. So yeah, we hopefully will, one chat at a time, we'll get there.
Just a very short question, but again, I just want to change the question just ever so slightly. And the question that's in the chat there is from an anonymous attendee. It says, I wonder how to heal after a devastating school experience. But just, talking about that, it's devastating for the parent. It's devastating for the child. But we're all human. We all think we're right. We're doing the best things, as you've said. It's also devastating for the school, the teacher. How does everybody feel?
Yes, absolutely it is. And, I hope I didn't come across as suggesting that it was, a them versus us scenario, because it very, very rarely is. It's tough all round because everybody wants to do what's best for this child. But as I say, if you're misinformed as to what's best, if you're not listening to the people directly involved, the experiences that, those of us who are autistic have endured, then, the difficulty, as I say, very often we talk about it academically in terms of epistemological and ontological kind of injustices that have been there with autism. So we've been dismissed, we've been ignored, we've been told, yeah, that's you're not like so and so, or but collectively, you put a group of autistic people together, you'll find so many commonalities, and so much of that is explained within that whole structure of monotropism, and it really, really is worthwhile to have a closer look at that. So like the healing part is very, very difficult, and without doubt, I think it's kind of like trauma-informed practice is hugely important. This is why I would like, in my study, what I'm hoping to do is look at this from both sides, look at it from both the teacher and the parent's perspective, because, I feel that, like, particularly in terms of communication, so much time is wasted by miscommunication. And that would benefit both parties, both parents and teachers, And I think sometimes teachers feel very threatened if a parent comes in that we're encroaching on their territory, they're the educational expert, and it is like, I've been both sides of the table on this one, it is terribly, terribly tough. And teachers are heartbroken when kids are hurt. There's no two ways about it,
Well, thanks. We probably just have time for just two more quick questions just before we do need to wrap up for 6. It's sort of just an amalgam of a couple of questions that are in there at the moment. And just, you've been talking about, autism and, how things have changed. But what we do know is girls have autism as well. How's that coming out of the research?
Yeah, very strongly. Very strongly. And again, you see, I think if we need to be careful
around teaching, because we have this in ADHD. Girls can't have ADHD.
Yeah. And again, the binary thing is an issue within the autistic community, because the gender recognition doesn't tend to be so strong. So sometimes if we're saying it's a female presentation of autism, we're kind of excluding a whole load of people. So that's why we sort of talk about an internalized presentation as opposed to an externalized presentation, And the things to look out for in girls would be that perfectionism, that having to get it right, that, that idea of the enormous effort that it's taking to do something that they should be so well capable of doing. There's so many things to look out for, to watch out for, but like, without ever having a diagnosis, you can see needs and address needs. And I think it is really about the radar. I would have often found that there were, in terms of my own, like as a parent, that there were some teachers who got it. And it was wonderful. The year that they had that teacher was an easy year. And then there were some teachers that, look, it just, because they'd ask the child, they'd say to them, are you okay? And they'd say yes. So the teacher would take their word for it. But of course, it's much easier to say yes and move on than to actually open up and try and explain what's going on. And I think that's where it's so important that we give parents that voice, because that will allow us then to see, the children, and to enable them to have their voice and their say, so that the parent's role decreases as the child can advocate for themselves in an ideal world.
Okay. And just one quick last question. I think this sort of gives you the opportunity to sum up what you have been talking about. So it says, from anonymous, where can we find more information about monotropism theory? It's very interesting.
It is fascinating. Yeah. Monotropism.org is the website that was set up by Fergus. Fergus is an offspring of Dinah, shall we say. So all of everything that's out there on autism is all on monotropism, it's all collected there. So yeah, good luck, monotropism.org. And again, I've linked it at the end.
Well, thank you very much for that, Elaine. We really appreciate the presentation. Thanks everybody for all your questions.
Thank you. The questions are amazing. Yeah, thanks.
Well, we could stay here for another hour, but we did say we'd end at 6. So thanks very much for that. And just to remind everybody, you know, this has been recorded. It will be made available to you very shortly. And our next one coming up is on the 28th of September with Charlotte Valor from the Institute of Neurodiversity on disclosing leadership. So thank you very much for everybody coming along today. Thanks to Elaine. Thanks to Gemma. And we look forward to seeing you all again on the last Thursday of next month.
I've just thought of one more brilliant resource. Yep. Autistic Realms is another very, very good one. But again, it's linked.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.